Price with Garden District Bookshop, and it's my privilege to welcome everybody tonight and to my privilege to welcome our two guests. We have in conversation tonight, we have our author, Ed Tarkington, who's here tonight with us, and he's going to be in conversation with M.O.Walsh. M.O. is the local author here in New Orleans, and I will talk about him in a little bit, but Ed's book just came out about a week ago, and so we're excited to have that in the store, and we do have signed copies. And I'm not going to say too much about the book so we can get into the conversation about it, but there's one quote that I wanted to read. And Ed is the author, this is his second book, and he's the author of his first book is Only Love Can Break Your Heart. But we have a quote from Kevin Wilson, the author of Nothing to See Here. And he says, there's a sharpness to Ed Tarkington's view of the world, an exacting truthfulness of how things work. But he marries it to such an open-hearted and resonant humanity in his writing that it's hard not to place him easily in the company of Pat Conroy and Alice McDermott. In The Fortunate Ones, Ed examines privilege and friendship with the same incredible perspective, and he helps us see the difficulties of trying to hold onto yourself even as you want so badly to be transformed. An amazing, thought-provoking novel by one of our most generous writers. High praise there, Ed. In good company there with Pat Conroy and Alice McDermott.
Indeed.
So anyway, M.O., also known as M.O.Walsh, was born and raised in Baton Rouge, and his fiction and essays have appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, the Paris Review, the Southern Review, Oxford American, Best New American Voices, and many others. He's a graduate of the MFA program at Ole Miss, and also has degrees from the University of Tennessee and LSU. And Neil currently directs the Creative Writing Workshop at the University of New Orleans. He lives with his family near Lake Pontchartrain here in New Orleans. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to turn this over. By the way, for everyone to know, there's the you'll see the chat board button on the Zoom menu, and we'll be taking questions. People will want to type out questions during the event, and we'll take a look at those and answer those either during the talk or at the very end of the conversation. So anyway, I'm going to turn this over to Ed and Neil. Welcome to the Garden District Bookshop.
Thank you.
Thanks, man.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Sure thing.
Well, I'll start just by saying I'm very happy to be here to talk about Ed's book. Me and Ed met, I guess, it was probably 2015 or so. Our first novels came out right around the same time, and actually had a lot in common. They both had song lyrics and in the title. They're both sort of like coming of age books set in the South. And I remember reading it and being really struck by how much I liked his prose and just sort of what his writing's generally about. And I feel the same way about this book. I just was able to read it before this meeting here. And, you know, one of the things I really like, a lot of my favorite writers are not so much the shock and awe writers, but the writers that are sort of interested in you know, just human relationships and the sort of subtle shifts of emotion and insight. And Ed does that one here too, like he did in his first one. So I was really glad to see that. But this is the Ed Tarkington show, so I don't want to talk too much. What I'd like to do, Ed, is maybe see if you want to tell people a little bit sort of just about the premise of the book. And if you're willing to read a couple minutes, that'd be cool too. And then we can just chat, whatever you want to do.
Thanks, man. And Neil, thank you so much for agreeing to do this. You know, like Neil was mentioning, my book came out, I think, you know, maybe 5 or 6 months after Neil's first book, My Sunshine Away. And I deliberately avoided reading your book until after mine came out. And then I read it, and it was just a kind of a total stop the presses and don't do anything else until I finish this book kind of experience for me. I just absolutely loved it. And
thanks,
Big
man.
Door Prize kicks ass too. And I'm just really honored that you agreed to hang out with me a little bit here. I wish we were doing it in person because we always have a good time.
Yeah.
I think that, you know, for me, I sort of say the short version of the elevator pitch for this book is, you know, All the King's Men crossed with Brideshead Revisited, situated in the contemporary American South. And a slightly more elaborate explanation would be, you got a boy who grows up not on the wrong side of the tracks, but on the less affluent side of the river, ends up by circumstance in the world of people who are fabulously wealthy, and in particular kind of falls under the sway of a fellow a little bit older than him who is already planning from a very young age to rise high in the world, and gets kind of swept up into that. And the story sort of tracks that friendship over the course of basically, it sort of begins with Charlie, the narrator, discovering that his friend Arch has committed suicide, who at that time is a U.S. senator. And then he kind of tracks back to tell us how they came to know each other and everything that they'd been through together. And so I wanted it to be a novel about friendship. I wanted it to be a novel about how someone can, sort of lock on to another person as a source of identity when they're insecure themselves. I wanted it to reflect, something that I feel is really sort of exacerbated in our time, this real tension between people who are very privileged and entitled and well-meaning, but not necessarily able to understand what it's like to come from a life where you don't have those kinds of advantages and just see the world through a different lens completely. And also I wanted to kind of take a look at, when I started to write it, what I saw emerging as a very, very troubling time in politics in America, where good people were kind of starting to bad things for what they considered to be necessary reasons. And then, now we're sort of in this place where, people can't really see good from bad. I use that epigraph in the beginning of the novel where Robert Penn Warren talks about in All the King's Men that people are not all good or bad, but are some good and some bad, and the devil take the hindmost. And I wanted to kind of explore the moral ambiguity of the time that we're living in, which really isn't any different from any other time, but feels very new to us and very difficult and painful and striking. So that was kind of, I started with that, and I never could have anticipated that it would have sort of fit the moment as it seems to be.
Do you want to read anything from it or no?
Oh, right.
It's up to you.
I can read. I'm just going to read one paragraph.
It's the last one, though. Don't worry about it. It's the last one in the book.
The last paragraph? Well, this comes from the sort of near the beginning of the second half of the novel, around the time that Arch, who is sort of the golden child that the narrator Charlie becomes infatuated with, who's now an adult and has become very successful in finance and has decided to enter the world of politics by declaring candidacy for mayor of Nashville. And this happens in the moment when he's announcing his candidacy while delivering a commencement speech at the boys' high school alma mater. How did a guy like Arch Cray, born into wealth, educated privately from pre-K through graduate school, married to the daughter of a billionaire, as handsome as a film star, with family ties going back almost to Jamestown, become a man of the people? After all, the people were the ones who shopped at Walmart, who spent their lives traveling back and forth between back-baking jobs and weary inertia at home, who ended up being forced to live off disability and Medicaid benefits. How on earth could the people see a guy who lived on Belmead Boulevard as their champion? There's nothing in this world to which people connect more willingly in uncertain times than the appearance of genuine certainty. If there was one true thing that could be said about Arch, it was this: he seemed so sure of himself that people couldn't help but believe in him.
Well, that leads me to a question I wanted to ask you. So I've done some of these things too, and I'm always leery to give too much away about the book because you actually want people to get the book and read it, right? So I don't want to give too much plot stuff away, but I mean, you've already said, one of the main characters, Arch, ends up running for office. So I'll let people know there's a lot of politics in this book. And one thing that was interesting to me, it's not, I wouldn't say it's like necessarily like a political book as much as it is about politicking and campaigns, right? I mean, you have a lot of stuff about actual political campaigns, and that from that paragraph you read, I remember reading that and thinking, so I wonder if there's like a model for this, because it's not, and so the line I think of is, how did this person that came from such wealth end up being like a populist sort of candidate, a person of the people? But you were writing this before the sort of Trump phenomenon, right? So, I mean, did you have a model for Arch? Is this a George Bush? Is this a W sort of character, or who is this?
Well, when I the person that I was thinking of when I started writing this novel is a Nashville politician who I also kind of fictionalized in the novel, the former Senate Minority Leader, Bill Frist.
Okay.
Who's an alum and a board member of the school where I work. And I remembered, I grew up in a Republican family, and then, I went to college and graduate school, and I fell in love with a beautiful girl whose family were Democrats. And so then I was a Democrat, right?
That's easy addition right there. Yes.
Yes. And I mean, just a complete side tangent. I think that, probably 3/4 of the people who had to go before the House Un-American Activities Committee during McCarthyism were people who like, look, I just went to a meeting because I was trying to meet this girl, right? But, I have never been one of those people who I've always kind of felt like, okay, well, I know what my sort of political allegiances are or preferences, but I don't see the other side as the enemy. And I've always sort of, looked for people on the other side to admire. And I always thought, well, Bill Frist, that's a guy I can admire. He's a surgeon, and he comes from this really, really affluent family, but, he chose to go into public service. And in his life after public office, he's been working, on medical relief in sub-Saharan Africa. And just, this guy, he could just sit back and watch his wealth multiply and do absolutely nothing but play golf. And he's, doing a lot of good in the world. But when I was living in Florida, and I was at Florida State when I was a grad student, which is where I met Matt, we were talking about before, Matt Bondurant, who I talked to the other day. That was when the Terry Schiavo situation happened, which I kind of fictionalized in the novel as well. And Bill Frist went out on the Senate floor and kind of sided with the right to life people, saying that, she had brain activity when all the other doctors who had examined her had said she had no brain activity. And I was just like, he's a doctor. He knows that, first of all, you can't make a diagnosis from watching a videotape. And second of all, this is, he knew that what he was saying, couldn't, most likely wasn't true. And then, almost immediately after, like the next day, he kind of backed up on it. And this was interesting because I was living in Florida at the time, which is where this all happened. And I was in Tallahassee. And so there were kooky, right to life activists, like all over the place in downtown Tallahassee, and Waynesboro Baptist Church people were there. And it was really kind of a sort of a crazy scene around the time that this was happening. You drive by the Capitol building and there were just, probably 1,000 people out, with signs on both sides. And I just remember thinking to myself, what would lead a guy who has, just so obviously got a ton of integrity, and I may not agree with him politically, but I think he's a really good person, to just, kind of get up in front of a microphone and say something that he, I think, knew wasn't true. I mean, I'm not trying to slander the man or anything like that, but I was just like, this can't be true. And of course it turned out, it wasn't. And so I always wanted to write about that. I was like, I wanted to write about how a person who like this, who goes into public life, finds himself in a situation where he's basically compelled to get in front of a microphone and say something that he knows not to be true because someone has convinced him that this is, a necessary evil. And then kind of in the middle of writing it, Trump happened. And, while my strongest reaction to that personally was like, oh, this book that I'm writing now, just like the reality is completely outstripped the possibilities of fiction. What am I going to do?
Right.
How am I going to deal with this? And so you sort of mentioned before that, it has politics, but it's not really about, politics so much as politicking. But I really was like, okay, well, maybe it's just going to be more about human relationships. And maybe it's going to be more about friendship. And I kind of went back and rewrote everything that I've done up to that to make it more about, the relationships between sort of the three main characters. But then, sort of the closer I got to it, and as we got a little bit further into the story, and it became just sort of clearer how, Donald Trump had been able to kind of captivate the loyalty of, people that are so different from him, and whom, I really don't think, he would probably want to, invite out to be in his golf foursome. That really just sort of struck me. And I can't say that any part of what I was writing was inspired by that, but it gave me a sort of assurance that, this is a phenomenon, and certainly one in Tennessee where, as the strength of the deep redness of Tennessee in terms of politics, the Tea Party power, and the kind of drain the swamp mentality is so strong, that I feel like these guys like Bob Corker or Lamar Alexander, Bob Corker finally, he had to resign because he just didn't want to have to keep carrying Trump's water anymore, and he knew that would be it for him. He'd get primary. So I kind of got interested in that. So that was the model, but in the end, I don't really think that they became their own people. You know how it goes. You start out with an idea, and then they just sort of invent themselves. And
I always think it's so interesting. With the W stuff, it was always like, well, he's the type of candidate I would love to have a beer with,
right.
and then that turns into like, this is like the candidate that would never have a beer with me. Like, I still love him, and so I was thinking about like where are your candidates on that spectrum? But you have to read the book to to see, because it's mainly, the politicians are mainly conservative, affluent, white politicians, who doing what they think is best in lots of ways, right? So it's interesting. But I'll tell you one thing I really respect about the book, and a lot of novels I've read lately, which are books that are sort of you sort of feel like you're seeing someone's entire life. Okay, and so the main character of this book, Charlie Boykin, is a person that honestly, from the beginning of it happens sort of asynchronously, but from the beginning of the book to the end, you've really witnessed like 50 years of this person's life. It's really, it's sort of remarkable. And so I just didn't know if you set out with that sort of goal. I know for me, like, I'm always trying to like limit the book as much as possible, because I'm always afraid, like, if I start a novel and I let it get too big, then I'm in trouble. So what I'm always looking for are like guardrails, right? So I don't want to have 10 suspects in a crime. I want to have 4. I don't want something set in New York City. I want it set in a very small town. I'm always trying to limit what I'm doing. Otherwise, it gets unruly, right? And so, but here, I think you've done a really good job. You have a person that's had all sorts of different experiences, has lived in Tennessee, lived in Mexico, been sort of all over the place. Was that sort of your initial intent to sort of do almost an entire life, or did things just sort of change once you bit into this character?
Yes, it was my intention, and the reason why was because I read Brideshead Revisited, and I don't know if you've ever read that by Evelyn.
I don't know a single thing about that book.
Well, it's interesting, and I'm a number of my sort of reviews and blurbs and so forth for this book so far have invoked The Great Gatsby, and that is a really flattering comparison, right? Insanely flattering comparison. And I'll take it, you know, I mean, I'm
yeah.
definitely not going to correct people on that, but I never thought about that book at all when I was writing
Right.
The Fortunate Ones. I was thinking about Brideshead Revisited, which of course, you know, is not nearly as popular or widely read a novel. And it's got a kind of similar structure, and I, you know, I read it for the first time in you know, a really long time. This is kind of a funny story. It's a quick one, so bear with me. When I was in college and I went home with that beautiful girl that I mentioned before, who turned me into a Democrat, who, by the way, is now my wife. And I was first introduced to her father, and he knew I was an English major, so he was asking me questions about what I like to read, and he was kind of an aficionado of, you know, 19th and 20th century British literature, and at the time, all I was reading was, you know, American Southern lit, so I couldn't think of any British writer, British novelist except for Charles Dickens, and this, you know, my father-in-law is like Anthony Trollope is his hero, and I'd never even heard of Anthony Trollope before. And I'm just trying to pretend like I didn't, you know, like, oh yeah, right, Trollope, yeah, I've heard he's good. And he says to me, well, have you ever read Evelyn Waugh? And I was like, no, sir, but I've heard she's really good. And he just sort of gently says, son, Evelyn Waugh is a man. And I was just like, oh, and I just felt like such an idiot. And so for, you know, 25 years, I absolutely, every time I'd see a book with Evelyn Waugh's name on the spine, I just feel this fury at the man for having a woman's name and making me look like an idiot in front of my girlfriend's father. And then finally, I was like, all right, the hell with it. I'm going to read this book. And I loved it. I just thought it was fantastic. And it has a very similar structure. And it's about a lot of the same things, about this kind of, you know, Edwardian culture of wealth and affluence that is disappearing in England, and this young man who is not poor, but certainly not as affluent as this family that he comes to be kind of taken in by. And it tracks kind of the same way, where he starts out and he's a soldier in the army in World War II, and they're doing training exercises around England, and he comes out of a tent one morning and he realizes, after they've moved in the middle of the night, that they've encamped, you know, basically in the front yard of the estate house of this family where he used to spend a lot of time, which then takes him back into the past. And he tells this story of his relationship to this family that covers, you know, not as much time as mine, but a long period of time. And I was like, I just love that structure. And I want to write, you know, a kind of contemporary American version of that story. So I sort of, you know, purloined the form, and so I knew what I was doing. I didn't know how my story was going to go. My story is not, you know, the same story at all, but I knew that the structure was something that I really thought, okay, I can nick this, you know, I can kind of use this. And I think we all do that, you know, we look for models, and I know certainly when I'm in the process and I'm not sure what to do, I'll go to the shelf and pull down something that I really like and see what somebody that I admire does to sort of figure out how to solve my problem. I expect you to do the same thing. So
I try to avoid everybody I admire in the writing process, because I mean, honestly, I get so nervous that I'll like blatantly steal. You know, I think that most of the, you know, honestly, most of like the good luck I've had has been through like sheer ignorance of what I was doing, right? Yeah. So, you know, like you're saying, you know, this book's getting compared to like The Great Gatsby, but that was never on your plate, right? I mean, so that's great, right? So you sort of stumble into that. I mean, I definitely remember like my very first book was a collection of stories, and it's about like this traveling carnival that like, and it's all this type of stuff. And I remember when I was first giving it to agents, I had an agent say, "Oh, here," and like slid across the table, "Circus and Winter," and they're like, "You need to read this." I'm like, "Oh, yeah." I'd be like, over my dead body, am I reading that book right now? Because if I read it, I will totally lose faith in what I'm doing, right? Mm-hmm. And so I feel like I really have to believe it's sort of a secret. It's sort of my own deal, and no one else has ever done it. Because if that's disillusion for me, I really I just run out of steam. I feel like a hack, so I don't really do that. I try to avoid the stuff that I like. And then when I'm between books, I'll go and read it and be reminded. But so that reminds me, since we're talking about sort of like, what we do, our sort of habits, as a writer or whatever. So you were saying you went to Florida State. This is a second novel. I'm always curious, you're giving us, the anecdote about pretending to know a book and you didn't, and you got skewered for it. That's one of the first things I always tell my graduate students is like, please, sin number one is pretending to know something that you don't, right? Don't do it. Like, don't ever do it. Like, no one's read every book in the world. It's okay if you say, I don't know what you're talking about. Like, I don't get the reference. It's okay. But when you think back about, I know you've had great teachers. You've also had just lots of experience. You've written a lot of essays, journalism, reviews. You've done a ton of stuff. Can you think of like a sort of, I guess it's two questions. Can you think of sort of one bit of advice that sort of really stuck with you? Or can you think of like a sort of watershed moment when you recognize, okay, I figured something out, either about me or about writing or whatever? Can you think of any of those?
The best advice I ever got as a writer, I'm not going to name this person because, it makes it sound like I don't like, I mean, this is a writer that I really admire, who actually once lived in New Orleans, interestingly enough.
It's Robert Owen Butler, isn't it?
It's not in-person advice. It's not in-person advice. I didn't get it from a teacher. I got it from an interview that I read.
Okay.
And this person was asked in an interview, although I have met this person a couple of times, but he was not my teacher. And in this interview, he was asked, what's your advice? What's your best advice to young aspiring writers? And I was like, ooh, I'm really interested in this. And then when I read his answer, the answer was, try to come up with something else to do. Just quit. You're probably not good enough. And even if you are, it doesn't matter. You're nobody cares, and you're probably not going to succeed. And even if you get a book published, it's not like you're going to make a living at it. So
right.
Just find something else to do. Just trust me, you don't really want to be a writer. If you can think of anything else to do that. And after I read that, at first I was just like, and then I was just like, screw you, man. You think you're the only one who gets to do it,
Right.
and it really made me work a lot harder than I'd worked before. It made me sort of roll up my sleeves, and it's just like, I'm gonna prove this guy wrong. And in a way, I don't know if that was his intention or not. But I think maybe part of the point of the question, my guess is, when I give this advice to other people, I say is that if somebody can talk you out of it, then you probably you kind of have to need to do it. You have to sort of bleed for it. And I didn't really figure that out until I wrote the novel that I wrote for my dissertation in graduate school, which I had I just thought, oh yeah, people are going to read this and they're just going to everybody in the world is going to think this is the greatest thing ever, and it's going to be made into 10 different movies, and I'll be hailed as a genius instantly. And that novel is still on a hard drive somewhere. It did help me get an agent, but nobody bought it, and I got a few flattering comparisons to some people that I admire, but it didn't work. And that was such a I suddenly realized, okay, you may never publish a book. Are you going to keep doing this? And it's not the easiest thing to do when you're also trying to make a living and have a family. And then it just occurred to me that I couldn't stop, that I just kind of had to do it. And of course, I really, really wanted to publish books, and I still kind of believed in myself, but I also came to the conclusion that it didn't matter. Of course, it would be a blow if I was never able to get anything published, but I was going to have to do it anyway. And so I guess the advice sort of rang true. And, I think the only thing like habit wise or method wise, the thing that I learned after I left graduate school, and that was when writing really got hard, because it's sort of the whole reason
no deadlines. Yeah.
And you don't have deadlines, and you also don't have free time. You've got to, you got to work. And, I'd have these days in grad school where I'd just, sit in front of a computer for 6 or 8 hours and, I might, it just was very leisurely, and my progress was slow. And then all of a sudden I was in this life where I've got small kids and I've got a job that's pretty demanding, and, trying to be a decent husband and father. So the time that I had to carve out to write, I really had to make it count.
Right.
And, I think that's the thing that it made me a much better writer, is the efficiency of understanding that if you set yourself an hour or two a day, which may be all you get, you better make it count. You're not going to quit and take a look at Facebook.
That's right.
You've got to crank.
Well, that's what they say, right? If you want something done, give it to a busy person.
Right.
Yeah. There's a question from the viewers here. Ed, when did you first start writing? So how long have you been doing this?
Well, gosh, I guess, that's a hard question to answer. Like, seriously, I think when I, sort of right before I went to graduate school and I decided that was what I wanted to do, I started really kind of working hard at it and writing stories as much as I could. But like most people, I was writing stories and making stuff up and doing things like that ever since I was a kid. And then I started getting some affirmation for it when I was in high school. I was part of a group, we kind of wrote our own play, and I did, a lot of it, and people seemed to really like it. And I was like, oh gosh, maybe I can do this. And I'd read some books that really lit me up, and I thought, that's what I want to do, is I want to light people up the way this book lit me up.
Right.
And then in college, same thing. I didn't do a lot of fiction writing when I was in college, but I published a few stories in the literary magazine. And, I had decided that I wanted to be a writer a long time before I actually figured out how to do it.
Right.
Eventually, it was really kind of that breakthrough of having enough people tell you that it isn't about being cool or having good taste or affecting a pose. It's about showing up and sitting there and doing the work every day and kind of clocking in and treating it like a job.
Yeah, but so much of it too, when you're young, is about psychology. Like you're saying, it's like what do people encourage you and give you positive feedback for? At that point, you're so open to the world. It's like if someone told me I'd be a great beach volleyball player or something, who knows? That's what I'd be, But instead, it was like one of the, in high school, it was like I first started getting attention. I was no standout anything, but it was good in my English classes and would write stories that would make the teacher call my mom because she was worried about me. And it was like that sort of attention, it was like, oh, maybe there's something here. So it's all about, it's just interesting that your story is very similar to mine in that sense. It's like you're at that sort of vulnerable age, and what do people give you, the type of feedback that you like, then. And luckily for us, it's, it was writing.
Well, I also had this sort of interesting thing happen. My last name is Tarkington. I am related distantly to Booth Tarkington, who was a very, very successful novelist in the early part of the 20th century. And everybody in the family always talked about him. And so when I went to my dad and, was kind of like, Dad, I really think I want to be a writer. It's sort of my dad, who's an insurance executive, his only reference point for this was, Cousin Booth, who had been fabulously successful, won 2 Pulitzer Prizes and had a bunch of his books made into movies. And my dad thought, oh yeah, okay, this is a practical career choice. So if it hadn't have been for my distant cousin Booth Tarkington, and my father had an idea of how completely hard it is to have any success in the creative field, he might have said, no, you're not doing that. But he said, go for it, son.
Well, I'm sure most people know this. It's like, that's the first thing you have to do is let go of expectation of reward. We all seek it and we want it really bad. But if that's what you're writing for, you're doomed to failure, and it's, I'm sure everybody on this Zoom meeting knows really, really talented people that have never gotten that break, or that, never had that thing happen for them that they wanted, but they're equally as talented as anyone you're reading in the bookstore. And so, I mean, that's what I've, it's taken me many years, but that's what I end up telling all my graduate students now. It's like, if you write, if you like who you are when you're writing, and not who you think you're going to be when you're done. Because that just never really works out the way you think it's going to be. And even if it does, even if you have tons of success, you never feel like a made person. You always feel like, oh my gosh, I still don't know what I'm doing. But if you like who you are when you're in there, when you're in the document, when you're in the world, then yeah, like you said, you'll just keep doing it, and so you'll be successful in that way. So I had another question. I was reading, you said you did an interview with Odie Lindsay. Who's one of my people. If y'all have never read Odie Lindsay's stuff, really great writer, but also just an excellent human being on the planet. But y'all were talking, and you have a quote in here, man. It's just like, it's just got got neon around it. Okay. And so I want to ask you about it. At some point you said, Southern pride is a sort of addiction. The first step towards recovery is admitting that you have a problem. Southern pride is a sort of addiction. And the first step towards recovery is admitting that you have a problem. You want to talk about that a little bit? That's just quite a quote, man. I mean, I think that thing might outlive you.
I don't know. Positively, I don't know.
Well, I mean, I'm curious about it. I think I know where you're coming from. I like the quote, and I like the interview a lot. I just was so interested in that.
I think that what I was thinking about in there, and Odie was kind of asking me questions about, I guess sort of the situation of Southern writing, or what it means to be a Southern writing or a Southerner, and sort of, how we look at the South today. And, what I was thinking about mostly was how particularly white Southerners, really resent being called out for or challenged about some of the problems that our culture is still suffering from. I think I maybe even talked in that interview as well about the Kubler-Ross model of grief, and that acknowledging how problematic and sort of still has still stuck we are in problems from the past, particularly in relationship to race, is something that we first meet, especially in the last couple of years, with denial, or I think it's anger. Just no, we're not any worse than anybody else, and Yankees are just as bad as Southerners are, and and then bargaining, like, but what about all the good stuff that we do, and look at all the things that are better than they used to be, and it sort of progresses through there to acceptance. And similarly, that line about addiction, what the first step of dealing with addiction is just to admit that you have a problem. And so for me, it felt like, and this is part of what I'm writing about here, is like how we get sort of stuck in this idea that a status quo in which affluent white people call all the shots, and everyone is expected to sort of conform to to their idea of what is good and right in the world. I mean, that goes back to antebellum days, right? And it's never really changed. It's all that has just always kind of been, a static part of the culture. And I myself, when I look at writers that I've admired, and I mean, even you see in Faulkner, who wrote more frankly about race, there's still a kind of elitism in there. He sort of makes you like, John Sarторus is kind of a cool dude, right? I mean, he comes across as very heroic and admirable in so many ways. And, I felt like, well, let's just kind of hit this head on, because it was certainly something that felt like an epiphany for me. And I've seen a lot of people grappling with it over the last couple of years, because they're realizing that people that they think are really nice people, have some views that are not very nice and are actually willing to kind of be out loud and proud about it in ways that, we were not willing to do until the last couple of years. So, I certainly don't feel like I'm trying to get over my pride in being a Southerner, but I also feel like it's like you can love something and still be able to see that there are things about it that are not great.
Right.
And you can, I just feel like that I've seen so much denial. I've said kind of, jokingly, and it's not a very funny joke, but I'm going to say it anyway, that half the reason the Civil War happened was because, a whole bunch of Southern white boys just didn't want the Yankees to tell them what to do.
Right.
They didn't want to be corrected. They didn't want to be told that they were wrong. They didn't want to be saddled with responsibility for something that they didn't feel that they should be held responsible for. It's the same thing when you hear people talking about how, like, well, my ancestors, I never owned any slaves. It's not my fault that, we've got these severe problems of segregation and racial socioeconomic inequality in the South. And I earned everything that I've got. So, why should I have to take responsibility for that? Just like, well, yes and no, right, man? I mean, and I just feel like that what you're seeing there is a sort of a flinch. Like, how dare you challenge me and tell me that I might not be, morally pure when I never had any bad intentions. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it's obviously a very complicated thing. I told you I was excited to make you squirm, so I was gonna like give you one of your own quirks. There's nothing worse than like hearing yourself talk back to you, and like, how do I deal with that? But I mean, I honestly, the interview is great. If y'all are interested in, it's on chapter16.org interview with Ed. And it is one of those type of things that is, I think very true. It's like, as we're all so excited, I think, as Southern writers to embrace that aspect of it, because there's such a sort of fervent following and admiration for Southern writers, which I think is well earned, because I think a lot of us are really damn good at it. But also at the same time, you have to recognize everything that you're talking about in that quote too, and and what is very obvious about the history, right? And what's the launching point for a lot of the pride, right? I mean, that's very obvious. And so I thought your quote was great. I think that when you read it in context with the article, it makes perfect sense. I just wanted to see what you're going to do when I asked you back.
Do you remember when we were on that panel together? You were moderating the panel at the Mississippi Book Festival.
Yeah.
And it was you and me and Brad Watson.
Yeah, I do.
And Steve Yates and
Yates.
Lee Johnson and that was a great panel, right? I mean, that was a really exciting thing for me, and it was called Southern Fiction Today.
Yeah.
And this was at the second, I think, Mississippi Book Festival, folks. And it was one of those rare occasions when, there was this huge packed room of people that were, really, engaged in what we were saying. And, when you're a writer and you go out on book tour, man, I mean, when there's more than a few people around, it's like a big deal, and it felt kind of important, right?
Yeah.
And it was such a good talk, and we were doing really good, and I felt really happy about it. And then we got sort of toward the end, and there's this guy in the back. He stands up and asks us this really sort of confrontational question about, like, what do you think it says about Southern fiction today? That what stands for Southern fiction today is 4 white men and 1 black woman
on the panel.
And we were on the panel, and he was real. He sounded very much like a graduate student. He used kind of the jargon of graduate school in English. And we all, I think, I went back and watched that video recently, and we all kind of looked like, dogs choking on their food when he asked that question. It was all like, oh, like, what, and it kind of chilled the air in the room. And I remember you had a great answer. You said, these aren't things that we think about at all as storytellers, and we're just trying to make sure that the next paragraph doesn't suck. I mean, we're not thinking about this type of stuff. And we all talked about it later, and we were sort of like, this was really sort of unfair because, we didn't ask to be called, the spokespeople for Southern fiction today. And it was all pretty much just like, okay, we've got these writers who have books out this year. How do we kind of organize them? And it just happened to be organized that way. And I don't think anybody associated with it ever thought for a second, that they were making some statement about, the white maleness of Southern literature.
Right.
But it sure got me thinking, and it kind of embarrassed me because I hadn't thought about that at all. And I felt like that was just one of those things, because for so many, when you take a Southern literature class in college, when I was in college in the 90s, well, who are you reading? You're reading Faulkner, you're reading Walker Percy, maybe you're reading Barry Hannah. Eudora Welty and Flannery O'Connor at that time were kind of, women who made the cut. Flannery O'Connor, who doesn't, you wouldn't know it was a woman writing the stories, very kind of dark and not the least bit feminine stories. And I certainly thought, okay, well, all of the writers that I, have sort of modeled myself on, or that I've looked up to at various times, they look a lot like me in the mirror, and that sort of makes sense logically. But it also made me realize that I'd been, in looking for influences that I felt I could identify with, because they looked like me, I was missing a lot. And so ever since then, I've really tried to fill in the gaps in my reading and my knowledge and my openness to voices that are not, white male in Southern literature. And I learned a lot from that. And I think that that's something too that, it doesn't mean that I don't think there are like problems with representation, but I think a sort of consciousness when you're setting out to write as a white male of like, how do I learn? Like, I remember I had a teacher in college that I gave All the Pretty Horses to, because I just read it, and it was a female professor that I really loved, and it's like, this book is so good. This was before McCarthy really kind of blew up, and right around the time that he first sort of, All the Pretty Horses was like the breakthrough book for him. And she took it home and she read it, and a week or two later she came back and she gave it back to me, and I was like, so what'd you think? And she said, this guy doesn't know the first thing about women.
People still say that about him.
I think that might be true.
Yeah.
And I taught it recently, and I was just like, wow, this isn't, like the grandmother doesn't talk like a woman. She talks like Cormac McCarthy, and or the aunt or whatever.
Yeah.
And
same thing. The Road is one of my favorite books of all time. But like the most clumsiest part of that book is he and the wife. And when she talks, it just does not sound like a human. He really does struggle. With women.
And I'm not dogging one of the greatest writers of all time, but what I realized was that if I wanted to be as good as a writer as I could be, I needed to really figure this out. I needed to really study the voices of women and people of color and try to figure out, how do I write, stories that, if you took my name off the cover, you wouldn't automatically assume that the story, was written by a guy like me. And I don't know if I've been successful at that or not, but I do feel like that's something that I realized I still had a lot to learn if I wanted to be as good as I want to be.
Well, that's interesting. I don't know how much time we have, but I'm interested in what you just said, because I don't even know if that's a good thing. Like the idea that like if I took my name off the cover where they know it's me, I'm not necessarily sure that's a good thing, because I think that you have particular stories to tell. They're in your wheelhouse. You can tell them better than other people. There's other people that can tell stories better than you can, or than I can. I remember one time I was at a conference, and it was like a disability sort of panel. And one of my good friends, Jillian Visa, she also went to Florida State, I think. maybe. But she, a disabled writer, brilliant poet and fiction writer, and someone in the audience was like, yeah, well, I'm writing I'm writing a novel, and one of the main characters, is disabled in a wheelchair, and like, I just, I'm just curious, like, if I'm going to set out on a venture like this, what advice would you give me? And Jillian is like, she's like maybe 4 foot. Her spine literally looks like this. I'm not kidding. I mean, she's got a million problems. She's got fake legs. She's a million problems, from the outset. And I remember she's like, well, what advice would you give me? And she like leans forward towards the microphone and she says, don't write that book. Back. And I'll never forget it. And at the time I'm like, oh, this poor person is just trying their best to do diligent, sort of service. But she's like, no, like I'll write that book. You know what I'm saying? Like, are people that have that experience will write that book. And so, I don't know, Ed, I'm not arguing one way or another.
No. I mean, I'm hearing what you're saying. And the more I think about it, I'm like, well, at the same time, I also want the way that I write to be unmistakable, right?
Right.
I want people to be able to read it, and the way that you can read the people that you admire the most, and that the distinctiveness of their style and their sensibility makes it so that you don't have to see their name on the spine to know that it's them.
Yeah. And Ed, I would say for you, I mean, it's not whiteness or anything like that makes it stand out. Like it was what I was saying earlier. It's about like where your interest seems to lie. Like where, when the paragraphs get longer, when they're about how people sort of feel about one another, you know what I'm saying? And it's about human relationships. That's right. That's what your interest is,
Well, but I also, I took some criticism, and I have, dealt with this in the past, where, I'll write a character who is African American, and somebody will be like, that made me really uncomfortable because I don't think you gave that person seemed like a token or a stereotype, or the women don't seem as fully sort of three-dimensional. And so is this like a Goodreads critique, or this is like an actual review? Well, some not the same comments don't come in the same review, but okay. I mean, they were in print, and I definitely like, I you can learn a lot. Like if you get a review that that you don't like very much, and you Google the person that gave you the review, you can usually kind of figure out why they didn't like you very much. And maybe it's your writing, but they might be bringing kind of their own baggage to the table. And I certainly, I write a lot of reviews, and I just kind of feel like, if you can, I never say anything bad about anybody, even if I didn't think their book was that great. But you can tell if I'm not like ravingly enthusiastic about it. But I try to find out, okay, well, what, how do I explain this book in a way that the person who will love it will find it? Because obviously somebody loved it, or it never would have made it into print. And it's so doggone hard to write a book and get it out there. And I know all the struggle that I went through to get to that point. And I am just not gonna, douse somebody's fire when they're finally achieved their dream just because it's not the book for me. I'm going to figure out how to write about it in a way that I can communicate to other people, whether or not it's the book for them. Well, I mean, I'll say that for people that don't know. I mean, I see Helen Tarkington is on here. I'm assuming she knows you, but that's my wife. Okay, well, people that don't know Ed, he is really a really great literary citizen. I mean, he does a lot for other writers, writes a lot of reviews, is very involved in the writing world. I mean, it's one of the great things that you can do as a writer, is to try to help out. But Ed, I mean, I sure hope you're not taking the Goodreads and Amazon reviews to heart. I mean, no. Okay. I think they're funny though. Like, I got a 1-star review on Amazon one time, and I was like, well, the person was like, this book is so terrible, it's the worst thing I ever read. And then I was like, well, let's find out a little bit more about this person. And there were about 150 reviews of everything you could imagine that was like, this is the stupidest thing. This is and they weren't books. It was like, this is the worst cat collar. It doesn't work. I was like, okay, I can take it now. I'm okay. Well, I can remember I had a 1-star review of My Sunshine Away. It was like, this is the least realistic representation of New Orleans I've ever seen. My book's set in Baton Rouge. Okay. Right. So not even the right city. Right. So I got you. Yeah. But I did, when I get it from, even if it's somebody, that's in a small local paper and, they find something that they don't like, I always think about it. I mean, I'm like, okay, well, can I do that better? I mean, even if I don't think that their criticism is 100% fair, or maybe there's a little bit of a grudge in there for some reason that they're,
Right.
they're grinding an axe because of some personal reason, well, maybe I can do that a little bit better next time. And I certainly, I want to, write in a way that feels like I really do, like the characters are really real and not just,
Right.
some flat idea. And I don't want, I don't want somebody to hand my book back to somebody that recommended it to them and say, this guy doesn't know the first thing about
Right.
women.
Yeah, well, I think you do a great job in this book. The characters feel very real. Charlie, I think, is very real and very nuanced character. Vanessa is, as well. I mean, you don't need to worry about this stuff. You did a great job. I know it's time for us to start wrapping up. We have one last question, just asking if you are working on something new or taking a break.
I am working on something new intermittently. I think, like everybody else, the circumstances of being in this pandemic where a lot of us are working from home and we're dealing with just sort of the general anxiety. I've given myself permission not to feel like I'm failing if I'm not writing every day.
Right.
But I am working on something else. I really don't want to say anything about it. I usually feel
Good.
like I need to be way into it before I can. But trust me, another will come. And I assume you are as well, Neil. How long are we going to have to wait for your next one?
Oh gosh, a long time. I mean, same thing. I mean, I'm starting on something, but I would never say a word about it right now because it'll sound so ridiculous that I myself will be physically ill. But when it's just a secret, like when it's just me, I'm fine, right? But if I try to articulate it to somebody before it's done, I always think it's like cooking. I mean, I do a lot of cooking, and it's like, why in the world would I serve you the meal before it's finished? You know what I'm saying? Like,
Right.
20 minutes into making chicken marsala, you're going to get sick. But if you do the whole thing, it's going to be delicious, right? And so it's a similar thing. And so, I'm working on a book I've wanted to write for many, many years, finally starting to get on it. It's crap right now. It's so bad. But luckily, I feel like it's the type of thing where now I recognize if I stick with it for long enough, I can get it to where it's not in that place anymore. But right now, it's awful, man. But we're starting on something, and just hoping for the best. That's it. This was a hard year. 2020 was a hard year to have a book come out. 2021. I mean, your book came out when there was an insurrection against
the day before the insurrection. Yeah.
There's now an impeachment. There's still a pandemic. I mean, think about it, man. It's really, really hard times for writers, for booksellers. Britain, I know, like you said, for everybody. And so you do it because you like who you are when you're doing it. And you hope that it's going to somehow, increase empathy in the world at the end of the day, right? That's all you can do.
Absolutely right. And I'm glad you mentioned that, just because, I know we have a small group of people here and they're, but people might, check it out later. But just remember, I hope you will buy my book and love it. And I hope you will buy Neil's book and love it. But whether you do or don't, buy your books from Britain at Garden District Bookshop or another independent bookseller, because they're doing God's work for us and help those businesses survive and thrive in these weird times, so that they'll be there for us to get together again when finally we are able to do that.
Yeah, thank you for those kind words, Ed. Appreciate that. It is strange times, and keep wondering when we're going to have a real in-house author events again. But I think it's going to be a while. But we'll continue doing our virtual events and having people join us and join the community, the literary community. But anyway, I want to thank you both for a wonderful conversation. Really enjoyed it. In a way, it was kind of nice not talking specifically so much about the book, but just talking about what's going on with you and writing and the world. Really enjoyed it. Thank you very much for that.
Thanks, Brendan. And thanks to everybody. Thanks to the Geldermans, Tarkingtons, everybody that's here.
Yep.
Thanks, guys.
And if there's any interest, I put up links in the chat board about where you can hit a link to go buy Ed and Neil's books. So
They're both really good.
they are.
Fantastic.
So thanks everybody.
Thanks,
have
brother.
a good evening.
See you
Thanks,
guys
John.
soon.
Stay
Good
safe.
to see you, Ed. Bye.
Take care.